네, 자리에부터 앉아주시고요. 지금부터 동국대학교 불교문화연구원 HK 플러스 사업단의 해외 석학 초청 강연회를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. The main thanks for coming to this very fascinating special lecture today. So we've invited Marcie Middlebrooks, who is also known as 강연회, for having today's open lecture. So she got MA degree in Seoul National University and PhD in Cornell University. Yeah. And she also had a professorship in National Sun Yat-sen University in Taiwan. So the topic of the day is Taiwanese Buddhism and religions, as you see. So 그 한국말로도 충분히 질의응답이 가능하니까요. 잘 그렇게 들으시고 이따가 그 질문 시간 질문 많이 해주시면 좋을 것 같습니다. So why don't you start?
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah? Oh, nice. The answers. I've been teaching in Taiwan for about 4 years now, and I teach mostly undergraduates, and I guess this class is not undergraduate, right? Are you a master's student? Could you please raise your hands if you're a master's student? Okay. And then are there PhD students as well? Great. And any undergraduates at all? Great. Right, 초반신, right? That's important. Our first start. Yeah. Is there anyone here who is a Mandarin speaker? A Chinese speaker? At all? No one? Yes. You won't know when I pronounce things wrong. I'll just someone's holding back, aren't you? You really are. Okay. Like I said, I'm not an expert in the area of Taiwanese Buddhism, but I have lived in Taiwan for 4 years and am very interested in the religious scene there. I got my PhD in anthropology. So my primary interests are in living religion or lived religions, but of course to understand lived religions, we need to look at the history as well. Is anyone here interested? Has anyone here been to Taiwan? Okay, wow, lots of people. What did you do? Where did you go?
Me?
Yeah.
I went to Taipei for sightseeing and then stayed a few days in Taichung as well.
Oh, went to Taichung, yeah? Yeah, okay. How about, there was someone back there. Who also had their hand up?
I went to Kaohsiung.
You were in Kaohsiung? Oh, wow. For how long?
1 week.
For 1 week? And when was that?
It was. You mean when?
When? Yeah, what year? What year?
5 years ago.
5 years ago. So you left right when I got there, I think. Yeah. Taiwan has changed a lot in those 2 years. For those of you who have gone, you probably will already know some of this information. Am I speaking too quickly? No? Am I speaking clearly enough? Okay, great. Tell me if you want me to slow down at all. I'm used to that. So a lot has changed, and we were discussing just a few minutes ago how there's a tendency, particularly when you're in a place outside of Taiwan and you're talking about Buddhism inside Taiwan, to just look at the Buddhism. And when you just look at the Buddhism, you think you understand it, but from an anthropological perspective, it's difficult to understand something unless you understand it in the context that it's in, right? So, for those of you who have looked at Taiwanese Buddhism before, you're probably vaguely familiar with something that looks like this, maybe, right? Do any of you recognize this at all? Oh, it moves, right. one before? Yeah. How about over here? Have you seen this before? No? A few people haven't? Okay. I think probably there's been a lot of talk about Dharma drum, maybe more in Korea, interest in Dharma drum and Chongtai. Yeah? Chongdae. Is it Dae? Thank you. Chongdae. Because they're related more directly to Chan or to Sun Buddhism, right? But in fact, Guanzheng and Ciji are also very, very big institutions, and I think some of you have heard about them before. And they're often referred to as the four great nuns, or the founders are the four heavenly kings or queens, as the case may be, of Taiwanese Buddhism. But if you just study this from the point of, if you just look at it from the perspective of Buddhism, you're going to miss a lot of the story behind these four great nuns, the four great royalty of Taiwanese Buddhism. So I want to get into this a little bit. I'm curious, a number of you are Korean, right? Do you learn anything about Taiwan in your Korean classes, Korean history courses at all? No, not really. Yeah, okay. So Taiwan was not first called Taiwan, it was called Formosa. And Formosa, basically, some of you have seen this word before, right? In Mandarin, it's Mei Di Dao, right? And that basically means a beautiful island. And Taiwanese are very proud of Taiwan having first been called the beautiful island by Portuguese sailors who were sailing by. The Spanish also made their way through. Taiwan is actually very close to the Philippines, right? Who colonized the Philippines? The Americans, yes, but before the Americans did it, who did it? The Spanish, right? The Philippines was a Spanish colony. It was actually a very, how do I say, a very proud colony of the Spanish. It was a very well-run colony compared to some other colonies from what people say, from what historians say. Not so much with the Americans, but the Spanish and the Portuguese did make their way through Taiwan, and the Spanish were actually in Taiwan for a certain period of time, right? Especially out from the Philippines. However, in addition to the Chinese coming over, can anyone guess, those of you who have been there, who were the more longer term European colonizers of Taiwan? Do I have any guesses at all? One more time? Sorry, I didn't hear. I'm going to ditch this for a second.
Oh, I said Portugal.
Portugal, yeah, we talked about the Portuguese, yeah. Not so much Portuguese so much. No, think about what's in this vicinity, right? There's this big, long island nation in the vicinity that...
Netherlands?
Yes, exactly. The Netherlands, the Dutch. So the Dutch, and basically the Dutch equivalent of the East Indian Company, the VOC, were very interested in Taiwan, and they came by and also spent quite a bit of time here. Okay, let's see. So actually, when you see this on maps, it's a bit confusing, I think, because the Philippines is much closer than it appears. And also the end of, you can probably see it a little bit here, but Taiwan is actually very close to Hong Kong. There we go. Oh no. Hong Kong as well. Okay. Okinawa is also very, very close. And the Japanese were another colonizing force interested in Taiwan for a long time. Okay, here we go. So, for those of you who have been to Taiwan, there we go. So one of you stuck mostly in Taipei, right? Someone went to Taichung, and some of you made it down here to Kaohsiung, and you probably didn't make it over to this side, the eastern side of Taiwan, and that's because it's harder to get to. There are very high mountains here, much higher than the mountains in Korea. And in the course of history, that has meant that as Chinese came over, as Southern Chinese came over from mainland China, the indigenous people in Taiwan were pushed back up into this mountainous area. And nowadays, most of the indigenous population that are, still living in indigenous settings are in this area right here. So this is kind of indigenous country, as it were. This is Hualien, and it's very beautiful, from what I hear. There's also indigenous groups down here, and there are a couple of islands. This is called Lanmu, which means Orchid Island. They also have a number of nuclear waste buried there, which is something that's coming up recently in Taiwanese politics. But there is some Penghu Island out here, and then you may or may not know that there are some islands over here, Matsu Island and Jinmen Islands, that are actually quite close to mainland China, to the extent that, back during the Cold War, if you wanted to defect, you could swim across. It doesn't go that way. Wow. This is like, it's like an exercise program, isn't it? Let's see, maybe I can do it another way.
Take it as your keyboard.
Keyboard is right. Oh, thank you. Oh, but it's so much fun to do with your hand. So anyway, going back to this, Bao Dao means, as you know, treasure island, and you will see that used as another name for Taiwan in many places. You'll see like Bao Dao Yanjing, which is Bao Dao eyewear, right? Lots of stores will use the Bao Dao name. Navy Dao is also used as well. And can we go directly to the languages for this? Yes, okay. So then this gets us to some of the difficulties of talking about Taiwan, which is only about half the size of Korea, about half the population of Korea. But boy, is Korea not linguistically diverse compared to Taiwan. Yeah. I never realized how monolingual the US and Korea were until I started living in Taiwan. And one thing you also perhaps don't realize as much is how different written systems are from what's spoken, and what educated pronunciation is from the uneducated, and how the imperative of being a nation, right, makes us able to endure productive miscommunication beyond what you would normally be able to endure. So, I took this, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but it was something that was kind of popular for a couple of years ago, the 9 different maps of different countries. And this is one section of the 9 different maps of Taiwan. At its most basic level, these are the different languages that are spoken, right? So this is the interpretation. Up here, we get Taiwanese Mandarin. Mandarin language, right, is a language that is spoken in mainland China, right? The accepted pronunciation that most people call Putonghua, right? In Taiwan, it's not called Putonghua, as those of you who have visited Taiwan probably know. It's called Guoyu, the national language. So we have Guoyu in this section, which is considered northern Taiwan. Actually, when people talk about northern Taiwan, they really just mean Taipei and the very vicinities of Taipei. That's one confusing thing. When you say northern Taiwan, you're really talking about a very specific cultural geographic area for most Taiwanese, and all the rest is kind of southern Taiwan. This is southwestern Taiwan, and in southwestern Taiwan, there are a number of words to describe the mother tongue of a lot of the inhabitants there. Some people call it Holo, some people call it Hoklo, Hokkien, Taiwanese Hokkien, Southern Mien. These are all different terms that have different names for in different linguistic contexts, and people argue about them. For the most part, as Taiwan has come to embrace more and more its de facto nationalism, the term that is being used is Taiwanese, Taiyu. And the thing that makes Taiwanese somewhat different from things like Milanese and Hokkien is, as we will discover later, the fact that there are a lot of Japanese loanwords in it, which comes from the Japanese colonial period, right? As well as the indigenous languages that got taken up into Taiyu or Milanese, right? So here, this is a very sort of holo-centric map, and the section here, which I mentioned before, is where most of the indigenous people, right, are going to be residing, speaking their indigenous languages. This is I don't understand, right? But there's some complications to this map. So can anyone tell me, just off the top of your head, what language is completely missing? Does anyone know what's missing? It's probably a tough question. I kind of have the hints up here though.
Cantonese.
Yes, Cantonese is missing. There are a percentage of Cantonese speakers that grow up speaking Cantonese, right? Another big one, even bigger than Cantonese, is Hakka, or the Koja Hua. Koja Hua. And this is a group of people that live more concentrated here, and then also in this area as well. So, at this point in time, most Hakka, most Holo, or Taiwanese Minnan speakers, and also most Cantonese speakers who grow up in Taiwan do speak Mandarin via the school system. But the thing is, over the years, the Mandarin that they speak is quite different from the Mandarin on mainland China. To the extent that if you compare it with, say, something that perhaps you are more familiar with, British English versus American English, it's much more different than the differences between British and American English. Much more different. To the extent that some phonemes, some sounds just get dropped out entirely. And it's very, very hard to learn. So I have to say, I spent like the first 2 years in Taiwan arguing with my people I was trying to talk to, telling them, no, you know, our teacher said, you didn't say it that way. You know, and I keep at it, and well, okay, I'm gonna call up someone I know who knows, and then they call up, are you sure? You know that feeling when you find out that you've been saying something wrong your entire life and everyone understood it? Yeah? You can see sort of why it's called 国语, right? Okay, so that gives you some sense of the complications. There are also tones, obviously, in Mandarin and Minanyu and Cantonese. Minanyu has a few more tones than Mandarin, as do Hakka and Cantonese. And there are, at some point in the history of Taiwan, the government saw itself, and to a certain extent, there is a large faction that does as well, as the homeland for ethnic Chinese cultural peoples. So there are groups of overseas Chinese, right? Probably familiar with that term in Korea, coming back to Taiwan. And when they do, they often speak some form of Minanese, if they come from Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines as well sometimes, right? They will speak some form of that, but it will be something somewhat different from the Taiwanese language, right? Okay. So here we are in Kaohsiung. It's one of the things that has probably changed over the next few years, the last few years. Kaohsiung was primarily a harbor that was built up during the Japanese period. And southern Taiwan, being sort of in a linguistic majority, but in a educated minority, has been a bit less developed. It's a bit less of the economic center, particularly now. And the current government is putting a lot of money into infrastructure projects in Kaohsiung. So these are some examples of these infrastructure projects. Right. Okay, so here would be another example, perhaps both of linguistic and the geographical sort of synergism that happens in these areas where people are not necessarily able to really speak to each other in a way that is as recognizable as you have come to assume speaking Korean or speaking English, as the case may be. This is an area of Kaohsiung called Hama-sen, right? The Hama comes from Yokohama. The Sen is the line. And this is an area where all the freight that was coming in would be put on trains and taken through. As that came into Taiyu, or Taiwanese speakers, people started they kept the Hama with the characters switched and came up with the Xing. So Hama-Xing. Not too many people know where the word Hama-Xing comes from, but there are a lot of theories. This is also true of Kaohsiung, right? Kaohsiung was previously known as Takao, and Takao means hit a dog, right? But people think that was not literally the meaning. It came from an aboriginal, from an indigenous word, then that was written down in this way. So one of the things that was hard for me to get used to being in Kaohsiung, or being in Taiwan, having spent some time in Korea, was in Korea people tend not to switch languages mid-sentence. And if you do switch languages mid-sentence, right, or maybe throw in a phrase in one language and then talk in another language, your listener gets a little bit upset. Maybe you're interpreted as like showing off your English language ability, or maybe you're interpreted as, forgetting words too easily, right? All of these sort of things go out the window with language practice in Taiwan. Speakers switch back and forth all the time. They can switch mid-sentence, right? Enunciation will be different. It's a linguistics heaven or nightmare, depending upon how you look at it. Okay, just some Chians here. Speaking of the Japanese influence, I just thought I'd throw this in. I hope I have enough time. I'm already running out already. You know, one thing is when I teach in Taiwan, I teach for 3 hours. Our classes are 3 hours long, so I have to speed up a bit. But yes, being there in COVID, one of the favorite animals of people in Taiwan is the Shiba Inu, or the Chai Chen, right? And so a lot of our social distancing was measured by dog links. This didn't come out very well, did it? More dogs. Yeah, this is another thing that Taiwanese in Goshen like to do sometimes. They'll bring their dogs and set them up for photo opportunities. Chai Chen, right? Okay, quickly, on to the school that I'm coming from. So, even the school that I taught at, the title will tell you a lot about the hybridity of Taiwanese life and Taiwanese culture. So the school is called National Sun Yat-sen University, and Sun Yat-sen is considered the founder, right, of Chinese modern sort of nationalism in many ways. But there are two of them. There's the Sun Yat-sen University. I know, confusing, right? It's confusing for me too. Do I go to Taiwan or do I go to Guangdong, right? Wait. Does anyone know the story behind this? Why one would be national and one is just plain old Sun Yat-sen University? This is something you will find at many universities in Taiwan. So when the Kuomintang, or when the nationalists came from mainland China over to Taiwan, they saw, of course, their island, their group, as the legitimate China. And to do that, they had to set up sort of a mini China on Taiwan. So a lot of the universities that have a long history in mainland China were then recreated in Taiwan with the word national before them. And this is the case of this university. It's not true of national Taipei, Taida. It's not true of Taida, but it's true of many universities that have the word national in front of it. I did teach some students from mainland China, and in general, the competition is much higher in mainland China than it is in Taiwan right now, with students falling, student grades falling. But hey, we have a beach, so, you know, and they just built a new big building next there where my students would go sailing. So it's, yeah, you can imagine teaching 3 hours, what you compete with teaching 3-hour lectures as opposed to the beach, right? Another thing that National Sun Yat-sen University has is Formosa rock macaque. Formosa, you know now, right? What it means. The rock macaque, it's a very close relative to the kind of monkeys you see in Japan as well. And they have become something of a national, or of a local mascot. People will put them in all sorts of things. How many of you have heard of Guai Guai Wenhua? Have you heard Guai Guai? Has anyone seen this before? You've seen it before? Yeah. Where are you from? Do you want to, I knew there'd be someone here to say I'm pronouncing it wrong, right? So, do you do this? Do you have Guai Guai? You do. Where do you put your Guai Guai? Above your computer? Yeah. Okay, so Guai Guai means tame or well-behaved. And Taiwanese, I think, in addition to the only place where language is so moving and flexible that I've been, Taiwanese love puns. Dongum iwio, right? They love puns. Now, before you think, like Freud said, puns are one of the lowest form of humors, but then, of course, he wrote a book all about puns. Very interesting book on jokes and their relationship to the unconscious, in which he sort of mined this idea of why do we find puns funny, But before you agree with Freud and say puns are a low form of humor, you should know that in the Chosun period, Koreans were really into puns too, right? And, I just got back from a short trip to Tongdosa. And I don't know if any of you have been there, but the bridge, the Tari, right? Do you know the Tari story in Tongdosa? Why that was built? It was built for someone whose son had bad legs, right? Tari, yeah? The bridges, they stand both in English and in Korean. So, what people have called, in a fancy term, sympathetic magic is very much alive in Taiwan. The idea that the word being the same word brings something with it. Yeah? The magic of language, right? The contagion of language, that language spills over into other areas, and this spilling over of meaning, right? This hodgepodge of different languages in the same sentence that may have completely different meanings but sound the same can be both practically and religiously useful. So, Wai is the name of a treat, but it also means be obedient. You put it on your computer in the office, and then a monkey gets it. Okay, speaking of religious practices, I think this is probably something you might not think of this as that strange. At Dongguk University, a Buddhist-affiliated university. But remember, at National Sun University, in front of the administrative building, all of the administrators, let's see if I can find my friend here who's in the accounting office, in the lunar month of July, which makes this around August, I believe, get together for Ghost Month and make their offerings. That was one thing that was a bit surprising to me, coming from the US as someone who has grown up with this sort of strict idea of the boundary between, or the imposed boundary between the state and religion, right? And then again, back to the puns. The person from Taiwan, I'm sure you can answer this question. Don't answer it. So here we have, for Ghost Month, we have some apples here. And during the coronavirus, apples were everywhere. There were pictures of apples everywhere. We got apples, they would hand out apples, right? Apples are another sort of pun that interested people to the extent that it had sort of, if not amusing, then somewhat contagious magical practices. And basically, the thing is, puns are such a deal in Taiwan that something that to me really doesn't sound like a pun that much. Ping an, right? is, safety, a good life, security, peace. The Mandarin word for apple is 苹果. Doesn't really sound like a pun, but the ping in it and the roundness of the apple makes it such that it has become sort of something like the guai guai that can cross over and contain something that is beyond language. Here's another common one in Taiwan. Pineapple in Mandarin is feng mi. Feng mi, excuse me. Feng mi, right? There we go. Got that one right. But in Taiwanese, it is, do you speak Taiwanese? Do you want to give it a try? Onglai. And lai. For those of you who've learned a little bit of Mandarin, or maybe if you've gone past a bunch of stalls in Taiwan, people go lai, right? Means come here, right? So, fengli is the lucky pineapple, right? Because the Taiwanese pronunciation is somewhat similar to the Mandarin pronunciation. So you'll see pineapples and apples kind of everywhere. Unless, of course, I don't know. Where are you from in Taiwan? Kaohsiung. Oh, okay. You're from Kaohsiung too, right? Where in Kaohsiung? Okay. You don't think this is all like it could just all be a plan to sell a lot of fruit. I don't know. Okay. I'm sorry. Let me get to the meat of this here. Okay, here's another example that I think those of you who are in Korea might find somewhat interesting too, which is Taiwan, as Korea did as well, had a lot of Shinto shrines built during the latter part and even previously of the colonial period and the Sino-Japanese War. So here we see the Kaohsiung Shinto shrine, and later this was actually enrolled in state Shinto for those of you who are familiar with that system, and it became a state sort of recognized Shinto shrine that was part of the state, not a part of Bupa Shinto or religious Shinto, right? Over here is a recent picture I have taken of this. So the Shinto shrine in Kaohsiung subsequently became what's known as Zhongneisu, which is a martyr shrine. But you can still see it's very clearly a Shinto sort of painting. Not only that, but Zhongneisu, here's a better side of it, has become a park. So it's a martyrs area, but now it's a park, and it's also particularly in this area. Did you ever go to this park? No? You get off on the hook on that? It's also particularly known to be a hangout for people who are on the make, as we say, who are looking for lovers or looking to impress someone. Here is a photo from that martyr shrine up above. Anyway, I think I'm going to run out of time if I'm not careful, so I will try to get to the punch a bit more for those of you who are here for the more Buddhist meat of the deal. There was a period, Kaohsiung prior to becoming more part of the Qing dynasty, or Cheongnada, right? Was very much a backwater, it was very much a frontier land, and pirates would use it as a place to stop or to build, or even people who were sort of running from whatever it may be, poverty, the law, the in-laws, would come to Kaohsiung. So in some ways, it would come to Taiwan. So in some ways we can think of Taiwan as a Australia of East Asia, perhaps, right? And one particular pirate that became very powerful and well organized was named Zheng Jianfeng, right? Or as he's commonly referred to in English, Koxinga. And Koxinga has been very popular, also, as is the case with puns, that he sort of unites these multiple and disparate meanings, right? That make it both simultaneously ambiguous and productive. So, what is the ambiguity of Koxinga? Well, his mother was Japanese, his father was Chinese, and he was sent as a young child to study in Ming China, and he became a Ming loyalist. His father was also a big pirate. So when the Ming dynasty fell, Koxinga was a Ming loyalist, and he wasn't ready to give up. So he stayed around the Fujian area, the southern coastal area, and Taiwan, and eventually ended up having a battle with the Dutch, who had taken over what is now an area that's now called Tainan, which is one of the older settled parts of Taiwan. And eventually he was able to push the Dutch out completely and sort of set up his own kingdom. Although, of course, this was nothing like what we think of as a modern state today with, control of vast swaths of land. It was more like a center and then working out to sort of bring people into his realm of influence. So the fact that Koxinga was both Japanese, Chinese, and, depending on how you look at it, the first Taiwanese, right, to set up his own unique sort of Taiwanese, not mainland China, that was Qing Dynasty at the time kingdom, makes him appealing to all of these different vested groups. And this is his shrine in the Tainan area. In Korea, I think it's still probably the case. I was at Anyang the other day walking around an elementary school, and I saw an Lee Sushin statue, right? And then, of course, with women's rights and everything, now we have the, what was her name? The independence movement. Yes, we have one of those too, right? Yeah. In Taiwan, you will see Chen Xiangong everywhere. His statues are like Yi Sushin statues. But you can see they're much more ambiguous in a way, right? It really depends on what you look at them, what you impute into them. Okay, so as I said before, Taiwan is something of an interesting frontier-backwater area. And there aren't many records of there being fully ordained monks. So the first record that historians have found comes during the Chen Shenglong's family's reign as the first fully ordained monk coming to Taiwan. There was a lot of different religious activity though, and one group of activity that might help you understand a bit more what from the Korean perspective looks like a Taiwanese obsession with vegetarianism is what scholars have named Zai Jiao. Zai Jiao is not actually the name of all of these groups, it's more an academic name that was applied to these various groups, taken from one and applied in general. But basically, these are Zai being a purity, a purification. It actually comes from the Confucian roots of offering rites to heaven and this need to purify oneself before doing this for 3 days. So it's a purification, a lay vegetarian group. And like many groups that I think, you are somewhat familiar with the idea of the mixing of these different components, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and also folk practices or beliefs. However, in Korea, you might be a bit less familiar with the Baojuan, right? Which is spirit writing or spirit mediumships. And this is something that, a tradition that continues on to a certain degree in Taoist temples today in Taiwan. It usually involves 3 people. One person will be writing, possessed by a spirit and writing. One will be interpreting, and the other is sort of helping out the situation. So these Zai Jiao varied in their emphasis, but they were also tended to be millenarian or having theories of a last time, right? So a great upheaval, fall, and then sort of perfection, the good life on the other side of that. And after the Qing dynasty eventually ended subduing the pirates, the Shandong clan, but Taiwan remained a frontier land. Women and children for some periods of time were not allowed to move over. This, of course, gives you the story about the Indian princess in my family myth, that for those of you who have spent any time in North America, and I hear in South America as well, is very widespread. I don't know if any of you follow US politics, but Elizabeth Warren, too, a number of years ago, was sort of raked over the coals for voicing her belief that back in her family, she had indigenous blood married into her. But I think this brings a point that so many Taiwanese see themselves, whether rightly or wrongly, as having some indigenous blood. And this raises an interesting point that people are starting to talk more and more about now, and something that I definitely feel as a US person born and raised in the US, as an American, be that South or North, which is there are a lot of similarities between the US and Taiwan. They're both immigrant societies. They had different groups of people coming over at different times. They're also immigrant colonial societies. There are indigenous people there who get pushed out. For the most part, I think that the way in which the indigenous people were pushed out of Taiwan was not as cruel as the way they were pushed out in North America. But it was also a different situation as well, right? It was very frontier, minor island, not, right? A different situation, but still. One feels this a lot in Taiwan, and it was very unexpected for me, but I think you can really categorize Taiwan in some productive ways as an immigrant colonial, a settler colonial, as we say in anthropology, society. Okay, so there were people who maybe had shaved heads coming to Taiwan on occasion. That passage from southern China, Fujian, those provinces down there, Guangdong, right? Over to the Taiwan island was seen as quite treacherous. You find this in stories and plays as a very treacherous passage. And people speculate that there may have been some monks who crossed over to Taiwan who were elites in, say, the Ming dynasty, but weren't really fully ordained. Nevertheless, by hiding within temples, when the Qing dynasty took over, they were able to sort of work their way over to a place where they felt more in line with the politics, I guess we could say, the culture and the politics. Okay, so I am putting this temple here because it was mentioned to me when I started planning this lecture. And this is Longsan Si, and it is a big temple in the Taipei area. area, very famous. Did anyone you've been there, right? Yeah, everyone's been there. Okay. So, like many of these more organized sort of lines that eventually start emerging, Longsan-su, like Cheongsam Dashi, like Sun Yat-sen University, right, in some way comes from the mainland, and in fact takes the name, right, and deities are sometimes sent back and forth as a way of enhancing their spiritual power as well, to refresh. So, early on, particularly Japanese surveys, colonial surveys, found that Kwanum was very, very popular in Taiwan, which, from a Buddhist perspective, makes a lot of sense. You can kind of, yeah, right? But then you have to look at the Taoist side of things and the deity worship that was going on in Taiwan under Matsu. Have you heard of Matsu before? Has everyone heard of Matsu? No? Matsu? So here's Matsu over here, and the way you can tell it's Matsu is she will almost always have this beaded hat on her. And with many deities in the Taoist and in the Chinese folk tradition, they take on different attributes depending upon where they are worshipped in different ways, and can change their affiliations. But in Longsan-su, in addition to Guanyin, there is also Matsu and some other deities as well. And when, after the Japanese colonial period passed, when monks who were elite monks from China running away, right, having lost the Civil War in China, came to Taiwan and started looking at the Taiwanese situation, they saw this kind of confusion of different deities as very superstitious and something that showed the low level of Taiwanese Buddhism, of Buddhism in Taiwan. But there was a period, right, between the end of World War II and the retreat of the Kuomintang to Taiwan. And that was a period from, say, 1945, right, to 1949 was when Zhang Jingguo or Chiang Kai-shek brought all of his soldiers en masse to Taiwan. And during that period, the Buddhists in Taiwan, who for the most part had been cooperating, at least in form, with the Japanese authorities, saw the writing on the wall, as we say. They saw the future, what was coming. And when they learned about the opening of the Buddhist Association of the Republic of China in mainland China, and that being reconstituted in 1947, they dispatched delegates from Taiwan to go to that association. And basically, within that organization, they were told, the Taiwanese delegates were told to reorganize their Taiwanese sort of membership system into one that complied with the BA ROC on the mainland. Now, this is kind of harder than it sounds because, right, it's a thing of the form fitting the spirit. And again, we bump up against this language problem. So, Taiwan had been a Japanese colony now for 50-odd years. Prior to that, no one really spoke Mandarin, right? Most of the elites, and particularly towards the latter end of World War II, with the Kominka, right? People were speaking more and more Japanese. Now, Taiwan went back to the ROC, and Japanese was not a language that the governments from, you know, the KMT, the nationalists, they didn't want to hear that. In fact, there are a lot of stories about soldiers from the mainland, say, coming to Taiwan, people getting dispatched from Taiwan to Taiwan from the mainland, and arriving and looking around and thinking, they look just like our enemies. Because people were dressed up in Japanese gear, they spoke in Japanese ways, they even spoke Japanese. So, since Mandarin was reinstated but unknown, and they couldn't use Japanese, they had to rely on Fujian dialect, which is basically another language, or Holo, or what would later become Taiwanese. And to do that, they had to find monks who spoke the language. So they happened upon monks who maybe were not from the most prestigious areas, the most advanced, elite areas of Buddhism, but nonetheless could use that language to teach. And one of those was Sihang. Oops, that's wrong. Sorry about that. Sure. And he's very beloved in Taiwan as someone also who had a lot of experience in Southeast Asia and with major Buddhist reformers at the time. So with Sihang, he was invited to, his story is kind of interesting. He was actually of very humble origins. He tried to go to Buddhist seminary, didn't make it through, ended up, working as an abbot and whatnot, was a very skilled person. So once again, he was sent out for a correspondence course. And it just happened that that correspondence course that he sent out for was on consciousness-only doctrine, which he could make neither head nor tails of. So he had to quit the correspondence course as well. But nonetheless, he kept at it, right? His head against the brick wall. He kept at it, working at understanding consciousness only, or Yushikron. And it is said that after that, whenever he gave a lecture, it was always on Yushikron. But he was from the Fujian area, right here, which you can see is closest to Taiwan, and speaks a similar Chinese language. When mainland monks started coming over to Taiwan more en masse, some came before 1949, some came sort of after. Some of these more eminent monks came through other areas like Hong Kong. They predominantly came from areas where Buddhism was very strong, with a lot of lay support and financial backing. And that would have been Jiangsu, Zhejiang, or Shanghai. These areas right here. So this is Jiangsu up here. Here's Zhejiang, and Shanghai, as you know, is right there. So many of the big masters that would play important roles in Taiwanese Buddhism came from these areas at that time. I think you will recognize, say for example, Fo Guangsan, right? The beginner, the starter of that. Fo Guangsan's master, Xing Yun, actually had a very rough time when he first got to Taiwan. He was unable to find a place to stay because you had this bifurcation of the ordained community within Taiwan. You had the really sort of elite monks who were able to make their way, get connections, and then you had the soldiers run the mill. And the nationalist government had been taking monks into armed service since, I believe, 1939. Maybe I have it up here. There had been some negotiations that these monks in the national service wouldn't need to perform killing, but as with war, things don't always have as clear boundaries as you would like. Okay. I skipped over that, that's all right. So Dongchu was one of the ordained masters from the BAROC who wrote a report up on the state of Taiwanese Buddhism to share with the committee about what needed to be done. And I've spoken a bit about some of these things here before. He ends up estimating that only 10% of the Buddhists in Taiwan are literate enough to be able to be educated, right? It looks really awful on paper. Again, think of the linguistic situation, right? Zai Zhao had been sort of lumped in with the Buddhists as well, and many historians believe, or many scholars think, that when Taiwanese Buddhism was evaluated at that point, there was a misunderstanding on the part of the mainland elite sort of Buddhists coming over and evaluating it. Also noted was the lack of an ordination platform, because most of the elite sort of Buddhist structures in Japan, in Taiwan during the colonial period had either relied on Japanese institutes or temples, or had left with that. So the BAROC sort of took this role then between the nationalist government and the Buddhists. And as you have heard, martial law, right? This was not an easy time. There was concern that the communists, the CCP, was going to come over and take over Taiwan. At the same time, there was a lot of concern too about the Taiwanese rebelling against the KMT as well. And perhaps some of you have heard of the 228 incident. This actually happened prior to the KMT coming to Taiwan. But it kind of gives you a sense of this, again, ambiguity, uncertainty in Taiwan at the time. So the BAROC was able to kind of, in some ways, make use of that, but at the same time, it didn't have as much power as you might expect for an organization that was doing an intermediary role and had the approval of the military sort of regime, the dictatorship at the time. Okay. One of the key powers that the BAROC did have was that they were able to establish a monopoly on ordinations. And they did this not so much by building their own chongni, or a place where, big temple where ordinations could be done, but rather they would rotate through different temples and have an ordination platform at those specific temples, but then supply all of the personnel, all of the teachers to complete the ordination. So this was important because to go abroad, right, you needed, of course, to pass through, get a passport, the whatnot, be recognized as a monk, right? And the body that had the power to sort of mediate that for you and decide your status via the nationalist government was the BAROC. Now, so the BAROC was successful in that sense. They were somewhat less successful in their dealings with the government, trying to get the government not to appropriate Buddhist temples or Buddhist land. And so in that sense, the BAROC has been criticized as being a very sort of pro-military, very pro-KMT organization, but it's also clear that that organization, that the BAROC had, the Buddhist Association of the ROC, had its limits in terms of what it could do, what it could ask for with the nationalist government. Shihan, yes. So, anyway, I think we are running out of time, and I want to give you a chance to ask questions if you have any. There were some doctrinal controversies that popped up, particularly regarding Pure Land and the criticism of Pure Land practice that changed the politics, the monastic politics within Taiwan. But one thing, let me close here, because I think this is one thing you have all heard about, mainly, which is Rensheng Fojia, or Renjian Fojia, right? What is the difference between these two? Has anyone considered that at all? There's a lot of talk of Taiwanese Buddhism being humanistic Buddhism. And early reformers, Tai Su, came up with the idea of Rensheng Fojia, right? Fojia, sorry. But Yi Shun, a later master, put forth his idea of Renjian Fojia. And the basic idea of the difference between these two words is the earlier one was aimed primarily at what was funerary practices on mainland China, while the latter was emphasizing the importance of life as it's lived now in a Buddhist context, whereas the later Renjian Fojia would be not only this idea of funerary practices, but also going against sort of a more Taoist deity directed practice, right? So it's not just the gods, it's not just the spirits or the ghosts that we want to aim at. We want to aim at the Renjian, which would be the realm, right? The realm of the human. So you will see many of the big four that I showed earlier using these terms somewhat interchangeably, but this is something of the history that goes behind the difference between those two terms. Okay. I think I'm already over time. So, and you guys look sort of tired. I know this is not a great time to listen, right? But maybe you have questions, maybe not. Maybe you have questions for our Taiwanese nun as well. I have a question for you. It's what we call a flipped classroom, right? How long have you been in Taiwan? Or in Korea?
Less than 1 year.
What's that?
Less than 1 year.
1 year.
Less than 1 year.
Less than 1 year. I know this is very general how you find it, but how do you see Taiwan Buddhism being misunderstood? What do people think about Taiwanese Buddhism in Korea, in your experience? So you think that, or Koreans think that about Taiwanese Buddhism? Interesting. Yeah, I think that is definitely a characterization that the big sort of associations of Buddhist mountains or figures in Taiwan tend to be an umbrella for a bunch of different Buddhist practices, and people take that in different ways. there any other comments or questions?
Do you have any question? You could have question either in Korean or English. Because
Thank you for your lecture today.
Thank
I
you.
have one question. Do you think any other differences between the colonial experience between Korean and Taiwanese Buddhism from the early colonial period?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm by no means an expert on that. I can say that what I have read, which has been in English, suggests that, like much like the Spanish situation in the Philippines, the Taiwanese colonial experience, Taiwan was, particularly from the beginning, it was sort of a model colony. So there was a lot of thought that went into the colonial administration in Taiwan early on. And the process of colonization too, right, was the exchange of power was much quicker in Taiwan, right? It was handed over after the war, as opposed to Korea, which sort of underwent, different forms of like, well, we're just going to represent you to the international community, and then, eventually sort of consent was extracted, right? So there's that difference. It does seem that perhaps another difference would be the degree to which government was centralized in Korea as opposed to in Taiwan. Government was more centralized, I think, in Korea than it was in Taiwan for sure. And also Korea and Taiwan were both seen as different launch pads for different areas. So Taiwan was very much a launch for Southeast Asia, whereas Korea was more seen as a launch to China. The Buddhists in Taiwan who were organizing themselves sort of, dealing with the Japanese colonial authorities, they organized a South China Seas Association, Buddhist Association, right? That made it somewhat different, I think, than the situation in Korea. But in both cases, the attention was not entirely unwanted. There were benefits, I think, to Buddhism both in Taiwan and in Korea, with the Japanese sort of interest in, at least initial benefits, in using Buddhism as a way to relate to the colonized people. Of course, you could argue that those benefits later on were stripped away by, questions of cooperating with the colonists. But at the time, I think that, you can't say it was entirely unbeneficial. Yeah, does anyone else have other, yeah?
How about competitions among religions compared to Korean situation?
Yeah, competition among religions. The big difference there was that Korean Buddhism, of course, was at a disadvantage when the colonization process started, right, in respect to Confucianism. And that, at least this is a story that has been told. I think there's been some historical revision going on about Chosun period Buddhism, so there may be a more nuanced picture of that nowadays. But Taiwanese Buddhism was not sort of oppressed in that sense, right? Or not as centralized. It was still very much more of a frontier place. And you can see even in Longsan Si, right, early on, that there were some attributes of Buddhist temples that seem somewhat similar to me, at least, as what happens in Taoist temples, in that guilds, work organizations, or using this temple space as a meeting place, as sort of like a town square, happened early on in Taiwanese temples, or at least in that particular temple, which may be quite different, I think, than what was going on in Chosun, Korea at the time. Does that answer the question indirectly?
How about kind of ordinary Taiwanese? They don't really see the difference. They just go to temples, or they just go to Taoist temple. They just to pray or anything, any temples, or just I'm a Buddhist. I have to go to only Buddhist temples. I'm a Taoist. I go to only Taoist temple. That kind of thing.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing me back to that. Yeah, I think that is very interesting. So I think that particularly if we're talking about, like, if we go to the colonial period, right? Buddhism was not really highly regarded in the Chosun period by many of the elite. But in Taiwan, Buddhism was and still is kind of an elite religion. It has a philosophy. It has an ethics to a degree that people usually don't associate with Taoism. So most of the Buddhists I talked with were, being Buddhists, very open to interacting with other people of other religions. Nonetheless, they would come back to, well, you know, Buddhists are more ethical. This emphasis on ethics, right? Taoism in Taiwan is very much this community folk process, and you will find that around election times, all of the politicians will go out to and be sure to be photographed visiting certain Taoist temples. Now, Buddhism, on the other hand, has remained a little bit more aloof from that process. And although there are certain exceptions, you know, the BA ROC obviously was engaged in some ways. There's also questions about, you know, Fuwansan, and Suji has recently had a scandal that perhaps a lot of people have been talking about as well. Nonetheless, Buddhism in Taiwan is much more elite, much more educated, much more Mandarin, much more Guoyu than Taoism. So Taoist temples, you go into a Taoist temple, all of the words for all of the things, you know, the Babui, that's a Taiwanese word, right?
Yes.
Yeah, do you know what it is in Mandarin? Babui, what's Babui in Mandarin? You know what Babui is? It's these little half moon things that you shake and you throw it down. When you want to ask the god a question, you take these two, like a yin and yang or a half moon thing, you shake it and you throw it down. One down, one up means yes. Two down is no. At least this is what I've been told. And two up is also a no. Right? These are called Babui. You go to a Taoist temple and you ask, well, what is it in Mandarin? No one knows. No one knows what it is in Mandarin. So you can imagine the linguistic advantage in some ways, that both advantage and disadvantage, right? I mean, it's two-sided, right? I mean, if there's anything about language in Taiwan, we know that it's powerful. But, you know, like a pun, you never know where the language is going to slide. So there's this advantage of using Guoyu, right? Using the language of the state, of the educated. Education after the KMT came over, all took place in Mandarin. Nonetheless, having said that, that makes you think that people who are educated in that system will speak Mandarin? Well, why? Because their teachers were coming from all over. So you'll meet people who were taught Mandarin in their class by someone from Yunnan, who speaks a heavily Yunnan-inflected Mandarin, right? Because there weren't enough teachers, there weren't people who could speak Mandarin, and the system of the nationalist government was such that it really set up this support political network for mainlanders, for what in Mandarin people call Wai Shengren, right? People from provinces outside. So another aspect of the university system is that the university system was also a Wai Shengren thing, and to a certain extent, yeah? And these alliances of sort of connections down through different languages, but also it's more tricky than that, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you're a Wai Shengren. It doesn't necessarily mean you can understand another Wai Shengren's Mandarin, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you speak Mandarin. But to get back to the point, I think that's the most striking difference is that association with virtue and education, and having some sort of systematic way of thinking that in Taiwan, Taoism is not really where Taoist practice is really not centered around that as much. Yeah.
So what you're saying about linguistic flexibility in Buddhist practice in Taiwan is that it's still valid and present, even though Taiwanese Buddhism is more of a Mandarin, considered more Mandarin kind of religious practices compared to other religions in Taiwan.
Yeah.
It's still present.
Yeah, and when I talk to Buddhists when I talk to older Buddhists who are born, they're Taiwanese, they speak predominantly Taiwanese, but they learned, a very mispronounced Mandarin when they were in school. Nonetheless, their connections with mainlanders who were big Buddhist monks is one of much more respect, I think, than would be the case if that person was, say, like an industrialist or a politician. And many of them, many Taiwanese will also, religion also becomes this venue for visiting the mainland, both in Taoist circles and in Buddhist circles. So Taiwanese will accompany their full or their, back to the mainland. They'll accompany their master back to the mainland and help them out around, and vice versa. And with Taoists, this is also true as well. There's a lot of moving back and forth. And I think this is something that is common in Southeast Asia in general. You don't have these as rigid sort of national linguistic country administrative boundaries as you do in the East Asian context. But yeah, and I think part of that may also have to do with Buddhism itself having that monastic tradition that you chuga, right? But you also you're stepping away from sabas, saba seigye, right? So there's also that component, I think, as well, that perhaps aided Buddhism in the Taiwanese situation. And you know, it may have been also to the benefit of Taiwanese Buddhism that they were not, you know, most of the big temples, most of the Buddhist infrastructure that was set up during the colonial period kind of didn't have much continuity. At least this is what many people say, right? Now, I'm sure there was some continuity on the ground level, but you know, most of the you know, the buildings, the big monks or nuns, right? There wasn't a lot of continuity there. So on some level, you know, we might ask how it was, right, that Taiwanese Buddhism has been able to be so successful, and there are a lot of answers to that. But I think maybe one of the answers was, you know, they were really on some level kind of starting from scratch in a number of ways. I mean, we can also talk about that time, that sort of starting from scratch, corresponding with Taiwan's economic miracle, right? You know, looking at it from a sociological, you know, anthropological perspective as well. There are these monks. Of those 4 main monks that I showed there, 3 of them are Waishanren, right? They came to Taiwan from the mainland. Only one of them, Ciji, the nun, was born in Taiwan. So I believe there probably is some overlap in that sense as well. Like the timing was very, very fell together quite well so that these, you know, large temples could kind of emerge. And particularly with places like Foguangsan and also with Suji, there was also, with this sort of starting with, you know, generally a blank slate, there was also like a need to kind of rethink the monastic and the lay relationship a bit and how that was going to work out, right? Particularly because there wasn't that organization there strictly in the beginning. So there was a lot of work to do, and they had to figure out how to do it while modernity, you know, while industrialization was taking off.
Maybe a bit of a silly question, but you know, already 3 of the 4 masters are passing away, just one alive. But usually, in the case of South Korea, when the founder passing away, the order usually decline. What do you think about Taiwanese case? Are they continue to flourish or slightly decline without master and secularization? What do you think about the future of those 4 major Buddhist members?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I can tell you, actually, most of my information, I wanted to state that, most of my information comes from books that are published already on Taiwanese Buddhism. They're in your library. And so if you know, please, I encourage you, there is one that talks about sort of the history up until the early democratization, and then there's another book that takes you after that. Jones, who wrote the book, Purple Book on Taiwanese Buddhism, suggests that Foguangsan is run like in a corporate sort of way, not in a bad sense of corporate, but in the sense of there being very clear ranks and rankings, and people advance along those rankings. So it appears that, according to Jones at least, that this is not as dependent upon, say, like the charisma of the individual person. Foguangsan really has a lot of different enterprises or organizations, vegetarian restaurants, newspapers, universities, right? There are all of these different components, and so many people working within that organization already that, you know, it's hard to think that it would disappear. But I mean, it's also a question, right, of what will happen to, where will Taiwan be in the future as well? I mean, this is something people are wondering about. And I think the economy clearly plays a role in religion as well, as much as we like to think that it doesn't. And so what will happen with the Taiwanese economy, and how will that, you know, there's no direct relationship, but I think that the stagnation, there's been an ongoing sort of stagnation in some parts of Taiwan, and how that will affect religiosity is another question too. I mean, one thing, just to, not to go on, but all of most of these big temples also have international branches, and that's another element that will add to the picture. Taiwan, like, say, for example, Okinawa, or the Philippines, for that matter, has a tremendous amount of moving back and forth in different places. So people really travel a lot. You get a lot of retirees returning to Taiwan who have worked their adult life in various different countries and return to Taiwan. So there is kind of this extension of the network. But on the other hand, you know, I have to say, Koreans might find this a little bit strange. I don't know, you might want to talk with some non-Koreans about it, particularly North Americans, and see what they say. But Taiwanese are kind of like Americans in the sense that, you know, if I'm in a foreign country, if I'm in this room and there's another American, I'm not going to necessarily approach them, right? That nationality of, or that feeling of connectedness in immigrant settler societies is such that, you know, we don't really form groups that quickly. And people say this of the Hokkien, of the Holo population in Taiwan as well. The minority groups, for example, the Hakka, are said to, I don't know how stereotypical this is, but this is sort of the common knowledge that the Hakka form really strong bonds. But Taiwanese are not necessarily networked to the extent that, say, you might find of Koreans abroad. And perhaps the Buddhist establishments are providing some of that as well, which of course in Korea we know has tended to be provided by churches.
If you do not have any question, why don't you give a big applause 네, 이것으로 오늘 특강